So first of all, thanks everyone for joining. Should be a great session tonight. We've got Anthony talking about leveraging field parameters, which is going to be a very interesting session. Anthony, I will basically not say much. If you're watching this, of course, on our YouTube channel, like the video, subscribe to it. That's pretty much appreciated. And yeah, Anthony, I'll hand it over to you, and you can do what you need to do, introduce yourself, or just get going straight with the topic, if that's okay. Whatever makes you happy.
Thanks, Ben. So key thing is, can people see the screen? That's a good starting point.
Yep, we can see.
Great stuff. Yeah, anyway, so let's crack on with this side of things. So yeah, I work for a consultant in the UK. Most of the sort of most experienced that are working with are generally working with non-profits, which is unusual for a lot of people. Very passionate about Power BI. I have been known to sort of Power BI has got a nickname at the moment, and it's kind of called my mistress because I spent a lot of time working on it. And mountain biking and baking is one of the things that I really, really enjoy doing outside of Power BI. LinkedIn address is there for people. I will share the PBEX file afterwards with Ben, so you can share it around with others. So if people want to play around with it. So what we got is that we've got a situation where this is based on a live situation that I had at work where we wanted to create a Power BI report that was basically going to be used for sort of data quality analysis or sort of auditing of the data. Now, from this point of view, is what I've done is I've based it on the Contosa sales data because it's got very similar sort of breakdown of data as you would get in the non-profit world. So what we've got is that we've got a whole set of customers and their associated attributes. And it's all aggregated data for this particular PBEX, but you could actually bring in individual rows of data for your customers if you wanted to. And I've also got sales transactions and their associated attributes. And again, I've aggregated the data in the PBEX at the moment. But again, you could have detailed data if you wanted to. We happen to have used aggregated data for our situation from a work side of things. So that's what we've got to start with. So if I give people an overview of what the data model looks like. So what we've got in this situation is that in my situation, I've actually got the customers as a fact table. Now, there might be other people who would generally normally put customers as a dimension off of the sales table. But in this instance, because of what we're trying to do with the report, is I've got it as a fact table and I've got the sales as a fact table. I've then got them linked up, the sales, to a calendar purchase dimension and a product and a promotion dimension. And then I've got a calendar birth, a gender, marital status, and occupation for the customers fact table. So when you think about this, is that, this is quite a basic data model when you think about this. But so if I jump across to this next one in terms of visualization of this data, so you've got the situation where, well, how about visualizing this data? So you could then end up with a scenario where your report user says, well, can we create visuals for every single permutation of the current data model? So you could say, well, yeah, of course you can. Is that going to be useful? But the challenges that you find, like we found with the situation with work, is where you're dealing with a number of different client bases. You might have somebody who likes to slice and dice the data in one way, but you want somebody else who wants to do it in a completely different way. So when you think about the customers table, I've created 4 measures for that particular table. Now, you could have loads of other measures associated with it. I've got 5 dimensions for both the legend and the x-axis. So when you think about it, I've got a total permutation of 100 potential different charts that users may want to, see. On the other side, in terms of the sales data, I've got 5 measures for the sales data. I've also got 3 different dimensions for the legend and the x-axis. So potentially, I've got 45 different charts for the sales data. So when you think about that, is that I've potentially got 145 different charts for a very, very simple data model in actual fact. So, well, what do we do the next stage from there? So you think, well, hang on, this is going to be quite complex, because if you had to try and visualize all of those different charts, I mean, you're going to have a report that's, if you say, for example, put 4 or 5 visuals on a chart, you're going to end up with a report that's, you know, sort of 20, 30 pages long, which is not ideal. So let's bring in field parameters. So field parameters, I know people may have used them already. I know there are people on the call who have used them. I've fallen in love with them because I found they've been such a great addition to what I've been trying to do, and especially in trying to build reports. So field parameters allow you to dynamically change the measures and or dimensions being used on visuals within reports. So the whole point about it is that people can then customize the analysis that they're actually doing on their visuals without you having to go and create a vast array of different charts and pages within a report, as I explained on the page before. Now, one of the key things with field parameters is that surprisingly, they're still in the preview. So if you do want to, if you haven't used them and you do want to use them, you need to go up to the file, options and settings, options, and then under the preview features, there's actually a, under the preview features here, there's actually an option up here to actually turn it on. Once you turn it on, it'll mostly ask you for a restart Power BI desktop, and off you go. So what I'm wanting to do is to sort of explain, right, so how do we actually use field parameters? So in this situation here is that I've got a basic x-axis that I've created. I've got a measure called number of customers in this chart. So what we're doing is that we're looking at just the customer data currently at the moment. So in this situation here is that I'm wanting to dynamically change the x-axis for this particular chart. So I've created an x-axis field parameter on the left-hand side here, and I can just quickly flip between them, whichever one I'm actually wanting to look at, and it'll just quickly change the charts. Now, if I wanted to, I could also select none at the top, and it'll just change, and I've just got a total on my particular report chart if I'm wanting to. I don't actually want to break it down by a particular dimension for this situation. So how do we actually get to build these things? So if I go on to this next page, is I've created the first chart with a measure that just shows number of customers. And so what we're wanting to do is actually briefly go over how to actually create a field parameter. So in terms of creating a field parameter, if we go up to the modeling tab here, under the new parameters option, there's one for numeric range, which is to do with what if parameters, and there's one called fields. So if I click on fields, you'll get a dialog box that'll pop up. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just give it a name, and I'm just going to give it a name of Z at the moment because I'm wanting it to go right down to the bottom of the list. And I can then go and select any particular dimension that I might want to use. So in this instance here is that I'm just going to drag and drop the marital status, just drag on the gender, and I'll also drag on the occupation as well. So I've got 3 different dimensions on this particular dialog window. Now, what you can also do is that you can actually move these around within here. But the easiest thing is I've generally found later on to actually do that. And then there's a tick box here for add slicer to this page. Now, what this will do is this will add a slicer to the page as it says. So we'll go and do that. It's now gone and created, it's created my slicer on the left-hand side. And now the thing is now people say, well, hang on, I select that and nothing's actually happening. So what we'll do is we'll go into the data section. So what happens is that when you create a field parameter, it actually creates a local table, and it's created this table called z-axis. And what you've got in actual fact is that if I go to the stage here, is that the first column is going to be the name that is actually used on your visuals. So this will be the field that you use in your visuals. The second column along is always going to be called the name of the table plus fields, and that'll indicate as to which table that dimension actually came from. And then there's an order column as well. Now, the order column will determine the order in which the actual values appear in the drop-down in the slicer itself. So, for example, if I go back to here, is that the marital status is 0, so it'll be 0, 1, 2. So if I go back to the slicer, marital status happens to be the top of the list. Now, you can actually go into the table, and you can actually go in and go and change the orders here by literally, it's essentially like a DAX calculated table that's been created. And so within here, I can go and change the order around here if I'm wanting to, and go and change that from a 1 to 0 to a 1, 0 to a 1 here. I can save that out, and it'll just automatically then change that. So on the slicer, I've now got gender up at the top of my slicer, and I've got marital status now second on the list. So what we're going to do is that if I now go and drag the this new this x-axis now onto the x-axis, that'll now allow me to go and slice the visual however way I want. So if I now go and change the gender, it'll change it. It'll change the marital status, changes occupation, depending on what you're actually wanting to do. So it's a very, very simple technique to use. It's very quick and easy to set up a field parameter table, and very quick to add the fields onto your visuals. You don't have to go, I've done it before where I've created a sort of disconnected table, and I've then gone and had to create a whole lot of switch statements so it can go and do the switching. Other times I've had to create another table and created another sort of bidirectional relationship in my data model, and it's been very restrictive in terms of what I've actually been able to do. Any questions at the moment?
If I see anything in the chat, would you also like me to bring it up as it goes, or wait until
just
the end?
interrupt me as I go.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, so that'd be great.
So now I think it's okay.
Cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to sort of the next stage of, this was a very basic sort of addition of adding the field parameters in. So what we ended up doing is that this particular instance came out of work, is where I've got a situation where I've now got, from that 100 different permutation of charts for the customers table, I've now got 5 visuals. I've got a slicer for my measures, I've got a slicer for my legend, one for the x-axis, and I've got what I've done is I've created 2 visuals on here just to show things in a slightly different way, one being a matrix and one being a column chart in the bottom. So we've massively reduced the number of options that we potentially would have had to do, and this allows now a user to select any permutation that they want on these particular visuals. So what I was going to do is that just change that one over. So in the top visual here is that we've got the same measures. So on the top slicer here, I can select as many measures as I want, and both visuals will just keep adding those measures to those particular visuals. Now, obviously, there are certain situations where, do you really want to be adding 2 measures to a stack column chart or not? There may be situations where you do want to do it, but this does allow you to give you that flexibility to actually to do it. So if I go back to one of there, so the other good thing about it is that with this is that I can go for example, on the x-axis, I can go and create multiple options on the x-axis here. And what will happen is that in the matrix up at the top here is that because I selected first purchase here as the first option in the slicer, it'll show the first purchase here as the first option up at the top of the at the top of the sort of hierarchy. Then it'll show gender. Then it'll show marital status. Now, what happens is, again, this gives users the additional flexibility that somebody might actually want to view this in a different way. They might want to reverse the order, and they want to actually go marital status, then gender, then first purchase year. So if I deselect the first purchase year and gender, I've now got marital status back up at the top of the hierarchy. And if I now just select gender and first purchase year, it's now reversed the order. So you can switch around depending on what you're actually wanting to do within your matrix. Now, the same principle will apply as well within the actual column charts as well. The same thing here. So in the situation here, I've got marital status up at the top. If I drill down, it'll then go marital status, then gender, and then first purchase year. Whereas the previous iteration, it would have gone first purchase year, then gender, then marital status within the column chart. And so that becomes a very, very powerful tool for users and makes life a lot easier. So so that's the sort of customers. Very similar logic to the sales side of things. Again, I've got multiple dimensions that I can slice and dice the data on, multiple measures that I can use. And the nice, easy thing about this here is that, which we'll get onto now in terms of the data model, is that in the filter pane here, I've actually got an attribute associated with each of the different tables. So what I've done is that, we'll get onto the data model next, is where I've actually filtered out the data model. So I want to show all the measures and the legend and x-axis that are associated with the fact sales. And on the customers, I've actually filtered it out so it'll show all the measures and the dimensions associated with the customer. So if I move on to sort of what the data model looks like. Now, a lot of people...
Sorry, Anthony, I just interrupt with a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because we had a question come up, not sure if you saw it. So basically the question has been asked there by Alan. He's saying about using the field parameters with composite models. He's saying it does not work on the newer Power BI composite models, and he's wondering if they'll be supported for composite models in the future. Can you speak to that? Do you know about that at all?
It actually does work in composite models. I've managed to actually, one of the things later on is that I've actually managed to get it to work if the field parameters are created in the original base data model before you create your composite model, then it'll work off of that particular data model. If you're trying to use and you can also use field parameters if you create it as a local table for one particular data model. What I've run into issues is that if you create a composite model and you've got two remote data models, that you're now trying to use dimensions off of those two remote data models in a field parameters, I haven't managed to get it to work properly. I've ended up with errors all the time. Whereas if I create a composite model, but I'm actually using a field parameters in the local composite model, so in the composite model, just for the one remote data model, then I actually have managed to get it to work.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for the answer. Alan, I'm not sure if that was helps, but it sounds like it would. So thanks for that.
But what I've normally tried to do is that I've tried to create, and I use field parameters in quite a lot of reports on Live Connection. So as long as you create the field parameter table in the actual base data model and then connect your other Power BI reports through a Live Connection to the data model, it works seamlessly.
Okay, very cool. Thank you.
So yeah, so give us a shout if there's any issues on that. So one of the things that I found is that people sort of think, well, okay, I'll create a field parameter table And then what ends up happening is that I've seen it in quite a few sort of data models. People will then go and create multiple different field parameter tables, thinking that, I can't actually create a data model out of them. Well, you can actually link them together and actually use them as part of your data model. So in this instance, is that what I ended up doing here is that I've got, this might be not standard terminology. It was just terminology that I used for this particular view, just so it was easier to sort of segregate the different tables that I was actually using in the particular field parameter data model that I've actually created here. So what I've got is I've got 3 field parameter tables at the bottom. I've got one for the measures, one for the legend, one for the x-axis. I've then got 3 bridge tables, which I'll get onto just now. One for the measures, one for legend, one for the x-axis, and then I've then linked those to a link table up at the top, which essentially has got a breakdown, which is how everything filters down. So I've got a list here of all the different measures, legends, and x-axis that are associated with the sales, the fact sales table, and the same thing for all the customers table. Now, there is also another little sort of small little table, sort of as an outlier down at the bottom here, which is the measure definitions table that I've got. And again, I've got that set up as a relation related to the actual measures field parameter table, and which I'll get onto just now. And so bear that in mind, and we'll get onto that table later on. So what we're wanting to do is, how did I go about, getting all of this put together? So if we now sort of go down to the sort of next level side of things. So one of the nice things about the parameter tables is that you can actually edit the field parameter table. Like I said, you can create multiple field parameter tables, and then you can model them all together. So what I'm going to do is sort of briefly show people sort of each of the different tables that were created. So if I go back to the customers table, in the measures here, you've got a couple of sort of breakdowns here at the hierarchy. There's a sort of categorization called absolute and one called ratio as well. So what I wanted to do was to actually categorize my measures. So I've got the absolute measures. So when I say absolute, so they all sort of come out as an absolute number. Whereas in the situation below here, I've got all the ratios. So if I'm dividing sales amount by customer, or I'm getting sort of decimal, essentially decimal numbers that really, because part of that process is that I wanted to create 100% stack column charts. And as part of creating a 100% stack column chart is that it doesn't make sense to create a 100% stack column chart with ratio numbers. It makes no sense at all mathematically. And so you can only apply that to measures that are absolute numbers. And so the idea is that I wanted to be able to restrict that visual. So if somebody selected a ratio measure, the visual actually, the 100% column chart wouldn't actually be displayed if they selected a ratio measure. So if I go into the actual measures table, so in the measures table here is, I'll go through to the table view. It's a lot easier to actually see what it looks like. So in this particular instance here is that I've got the first column is the auto-generated name as part of the field parameters. I've then got that field's name that we were talking about earlier. That is the name of where it comes from. We've got the order for that measure, how it's going to appear in the slices. Then what I also did is I created 2 additional columns here. So I've got one column here that is flagging up whether that measure is associated with the customer table. And I've got another column here that's whether it's associated with the sales data. Now, you may have a situation where you may have a measure that is actually associated with 2 or 3 different fact tables. So, for example, a calendar date. You might have that associated with multiple, so you can create, in that instance, I would just have a 1 and a 1 on the same row here, and we'll get back to that later on. Then I've got a type column here, which I created here, which is just as easy as going into the field parameter here and just typing in the bit of text that I actually wanted to associate it with each individual measure. And then afterwards, what will happen is, so for example, if I go into here and I go and add another option into here, is that it'll by default, when I click the apply, it'll create another column at the end of this table here, and it'll just create it with a generic name, but you can then go into that and change that column name in the table to whatever name you're actually wanting to call it. So if I just go back to the very basic one that I actually created earlier, on this particular one here, is if I go into this one here and I'm just going to go and just call it, say, for example, test, and I'm going to create another one called test 1, and we'll create the third one. So we're just basically categorizing these particular measures. And like I said, as you apply it, it'll then create a third column, and I can just go in and change it to whatever you feel is appropriate to whatever you're actually doing within your data set. So if I quickly go back to the measure here, so this is my column which indicates whether they're a ratio or an absolute. You might want to add another situation. So for example, I had the situation where I wanted to add the currency symbol to any measures that were currency related, but were still an absolute number, but they were currency related. So I had I had another column that would actually indicate whether they were a currency column, whether they were a currency measure or a non-currency measure. So essentially just an integer. You might want to have other situations where I've worked on where you might want to actually, instead of using bookmarks to say, for example, switch between a whole lot of average measures on a page and cumulative measures on a page, you might want to actually create another categorization within your field parameters, so you can then use that categorization to actually turn certain of these actual fields off in a slicer, for example. So that's the measures table. In a very similar instance to the legend table, I've actually got same thing. I've got all the different dimensions that I wanted to use in my report. I've got the customer and a sales columns here. Now, the other one that is also I've added on to each of these different tables is a calculated column at the end here. Now, which I'll get onto just now, is that one of the quirks with field parameters is that if you're wanting to use selected value on the first column that you're using in your slicer, you can't actually use that with field parameters because of the way that they were actually built. And so you can actually use the legends field within a measure to make your title dynamic. But again, you get quirkiness happening there where you end up having to use max of the actual the field name instead of selected value. Whereas if I create a calculated column, which is all it is just the legend name is equal to the first column, I can now use selected value on this calculated column in any of my dynamic titles and things, which I'll get onto later on. So that's why there's an extra column at the end, which has got exactly the same name as the first column in the table. Now, one of the things as well, which is what I did, is that I created, so my legend, so the order numbering here is that one of the things that you might have noticed is that in the measures table, these are numbered 1 through to 9. The legends are numbered 21 onwards. And for the x-axis, I numbered them 40 onwards. Now, one of the things that I needed, the reasoning for doing that is that I needed to have unique numbers. So when I was creating my bridge tables and creating that link table up at the top, is that I needed to have uniqueness across all three tables. So when you actually create your different bridge tables, so for example, my legend bridge, I've got a distinct list of the order IDs from that table. Same thing for the measure bridge and the same thing for the x-axis bridge. But when it comes to the row measure legend, which was that top link table up at the top of the actual data model, is that what I've gone and done is that I've actually unioned together all the different columns from the x-axis field parameter, from the legend and the measure, and I've also given them an attribute. So I've given them an attribute of customer for where the attribute value is customer. So this is taken from, so this customer field here is exactly the same as that field that I called customer in the actual legend table, the measure, and the x-axis table. So you can actually, in situations at work, I've actually got 4 different options here because I've got 4 different columns within each of the tables. So you can create as many different rows within this union as you're wanting to, and union them together. So what will happen is here is that I've got a distinct list of numbers here that all relate to the different link tables and bridge tables, and then ultimately back to the actual field parameters. Any questions at the moment, Ben?
No, it's looking pretty. It's looking pretty good. I gotta say, I'm pretty. I'm loving this so far, mate. I've got to say, it's. I never considered so much of this stuff. So yeah.
So anyway, cool. So if I go back to this data model here, is where we look at this measure definitions table that's coming off as an appendage to the actual measure field parameter. So as I've said, you know, if we go back to the actual measures table, I could very easily, if I wanted to, in the measures table here, I could actually go and add on a definitions column here and go and add a definition for every single one of those measures if I'm wanting to. Now, one of the prime reasons why I created that additional definitions table is because that additional definitions table that I've got here, in actual fact, is a definitions table that I'm holding in SQL. And so I can very easily, if, for example, somebody says, we need to change this definition slightly, we can actually change that definition within that table in SQL. And as soon as the Power BI report updates, the definition is automatically updated. I don't need to go into the actual Power BI, into the PBIX itself, go and update the field parameters, republish that to the service, and do all the other changes that I might need to do. So it's all built into a separate table that I can actually easily modify remotely, if you want to call it that. And so within each of these actual, go back to the one of these pages here, is that this little option here with the measure definition here, this is where the measure definition, this is just the subtitle that we've now are able to use in the visuals. And so that measure definition will appear within the visual itself. So if I select 2 measures, it'll just come back here saying definition displayed when only one measure is selected. And so it's just as a warning note to users that it won't display a definition, whereas if I select one, it will display the actual definition for that particular definition. Now, previously, I was using a separate card to add the definitions on. One of the reasons I've sort of decided to rather use a subtitle is that everything is self-contained in the actual visual itself. So people might want to take a screenshot and put it into a report. And they can actually, pretty much everything is within that report visual itself. So if I go to the, if I sort of just flip back onto the dynamic titles section here, is so, as I said earlier, is that one of the challenges that you've got is that selected value will not work with the visible column that field parameters generate, which is why I created that calculated column, as I said. The other alternative is that you can use a combination of select columns, summarize, count rows, as well as concatenate X as well. So if I go into some of the sort of ones that I use, so say, for example, the legend selection, I think is quite a basic one. So that was a very basic one. I've just got a selected value based on the actual legend name, which was that calculated column that I created. Whereas if I go down to the x-axis now, is that what I've done here is that I've actually used another variant of trying to summarize these, so I can then go through and I can actually concatenate those particular dimensions together. So what happened in this situation here is that if I go back to the customer page here, is that if, for example, I select only 2 dimensions on the x-axis, it'll come up with just first purchase year and gender. If I go and select 3 dimensions, it comes up here with and 3 or more x-axis row dimensions. Because at the end of the day is that if you've got a whole lot of dimensions, you might want to change it depending on what you're wanting to do, your use case. I think your title then becomes very unwieldy to list out every single dimension that was actually selected within that scenario. Now, the other thing as well is what I also did as well is that one of the interesting things here is that there's also this thing called none that I've gone and done in here. So on the x-axis, I've gone and created another version called none. Now, I hadn't thought about this, and then suddenly sort of came to me thinking, what about trying to do this? Because what I was trying to do is that I was trying to create a total in the actual visual itself, because I didn't want to slice it by dimension. I just wanted to have a total for that particular visual itself. So if I go and deselect all of these options here, and I just select none, this will actually just give me the total for each of the actual purchase months. So I've got no x-axis dimension. It'll just give me the total for each of these first purchase months, because they obviously exist in the legend at the moment. Now, what was interesting is that to actually do that is I actually created a measure that actually has, so if I show people here, is that if I go to this scenario here, is that in the row measure legend here, I've actually got a measure that's just called no selected dimension, and it's just got quotes against it. So what I've actually done here is that within the x-axis field parameter table, you don't necessarily have to have just dimensions in that field parameter or just measures. You can actually combine the two together in the field parameter table, which is exactly what I've done here. And so I can then change it. So for example, so you can then use that none to get a grand total in your visual if you're actually wanting to. So yeah, so if I just sort of go back to this x-axis, so it's a very similar thing here. So I've just created a measure essentially to sort of say to people, if they have selected none and they've selected any other options, then they just need to deselect none, because selecting none and any other dimensions just doesn't really make sense in the actual visual itself. And then just a series of switch statements, just depending on what selection people have actually made, to actually give people a warning or just to give them an information message to not to do certain things. So in terms of, so that's sort of the, and that was also going, so I've explained the measure definitions in terms of the extra table that's associated with it. There's sort of the selections in terms of the titles. And so, so you can use a whole different variants of these particular variants you might want to use. And again, with these particular titles, again, like I said earlier, you might actually want to harvest the actual part of the measures table that was actually used. So if I go back to the actual, some of the measure selections. So for example, here is that depending on the measure that I've actually selected, that'll then display the definition. I might want to actually use it to display a certain font color depending on what the actual selection was that was made. So in this situation here is where if more than one measure was selected, it'll change to gray. If it was a single one, it'll go to blue. Or there might be other situations here where you might actually want to count the number of select measures that you've actually made. I've had other situations where I might have wanted to sort of use the currency format from another lookup table. For example, from a country table, I might want to look up the currency and append that to the actual title within the visuals themselves. So one of the things that I have found in terms of limitations of field parameters is that I haven't managed to get them to work. AR visuals and Q&A are not supported. And one of the things which I mentioned earlier is that you cannot use them in a live connection mode unless the field parameters exist in your data model itself, in your base data model. But like I said, so if you can't add that field parameters table to that live connected model, then look at the option of creating a composite model, because essentially a composite model just becomes a local model. And so you can then add a field parameters table to that composite model. Obviously, if you cannot create a composite model and you can only use a live connection, like I've run into those sort of situation where I've got a live connection to, for example, an AAS data model, then unfortunately field parameters is not an option for you to use. The other thing as well is you cannot use implicit measures. You do need to create explicit measures to be able to use field parameters. So those are sort of main limitations that I found so far. I'm sure there'll be others that I will discover. In terms of, I've put in a couple of links into the PBACs. There is one here for Microsoft Learn to sort of, if you're wanting to learn more about just sort of basics of field parameters. There is also an article that I've linked to SQL BI where they talked about why selected value doesn't work on the original generated field in field parameters. And that goes into greater depth in terms of the actual the reasonings for it. And then there's also another one as well, which I've linked through to Data Goblin's Kurt Buehler. He's done a really good article about measure selection options where, you know, going through the options of trying to decide, do I use a bookmark? Do I use calculation groups? Do I use field parameters? Do I use, you know, a disconnected table side of things? So have a look at that as well. And it gives you a really nice sort of pros and cons of each sort of methodology. But I've certainly found field parameters have been exceptionally useful and very, very quick and very easy to actually set up. So there we go.
Wow. That was very cool. That there are no questions currently lined up in the chat. I had a question, if I can, I mean, just so everyone knows, generally speaking, you can ask questions whatever you want. If you have questions now, feel free to again write in the chat. I'll just speak or speak and switch on your camera, any one of those things. Maybe you, in the very last point, you might have covered what I was hoping to ask. And where might you use, because obviously, you know, we have like Tablet Editor where we use calculation groups. Now, of course, we have calculation groups inside Power BI PBACs. Where might you use field parameters and not use calculation groups? Are there certain things that you have favor them for?
I found for switching dimensions and measures on charts, I would always go down the field parameter route. Because calc groups, I've only managed to do that with measures. I haven't been able to do that with dimensions. And you can't create a data model with calculation groups either, whereas you can with field parameters. And I found from a learning perspective is that I would always suggest people to start field parameters route first of all, because it is so easy to actually set up and a lot more intuitive, I think, than calculation groups. to use. I've actually been working on sort of looking at both calculation groups and field parameters and how to combine the two together side of things, and how you can actually play with both of them together.
Makes
but
sense.
Yeah, that would certainly be my recommendation to people.
Very cool. I like it. Andrew has a question. Anthony, where did you use the bridge tables in the visuals?
In the visuals, these little ones here is literally all I did was I created in the data model view. I created a separate layout here, took a screenshot, inserted the screenshot as a JPEG into the PBEX. And then, so what I've done is within here is that I've actually gone and just taken a screenshot of my data model, inserted that as an image, and then I've just added on a text box over the top of it here, just to indicate which is a bridge table and which is a link table, etc.
Okay,
so not too complicated.
But are you using the bridge table inside any of the visualizations in the report?
No.
Okay.
All I'm doing with the bridge tables is that I'm using the bridge tables as a linkage from the row measure legend table that essentially is the top table that's got all the different measures and dimensions associated with my fact table. And then I'm using that to filter down through to the measures and the legends and the x-axis, because at the end of the day is that I've got in the row measure legend table here, which I'll show people here, is that, quickly grab this one here, is on the row measure legend, I've actually got, say for example, 40 is duplicated, because 40 I'm using both in the customers and I'm using it in the sales because that's a shared dimension. And so that one there, essentially I'm going to end up with a many to single, so I'm going to need to I've created a bridge table between them, so I can then get all the relationships to actually work together.
Nice.
So
very cool.
So that's basically what the live data model looks like. So you've got your bridge tables, your row measure legend, which is essentially all your combinations, and then your different field parameters at the bottom here. And so going back to sort of how many things you can actually create is, like I said, is that where in the reports that I've built, I've actually built one particular one where I think I ended up with, because of the way that the auditing report worked, I ended up with 40 measures in the measures table. I ended up with 40 options in the legend and 40 in the x-axis. So there are quite a few sitting in each of those now. And like I said, as I've seen it with people where the measures, someone might just go and create a measures field parameter for one little page and then go and create another one. Whereas here, you can actually create one measures table and just create that categorization that you might want to do.
Okay. Wow. How is that on performance? Does it have any great impact at all? Or is it sort of fairly
absolutely nothing at all? Wow. Nothing at all. I've not found any difference in terms of performance wise on it. It's worked exceptionally quick on anything I've done.
Nice.
So if we go back to here, so for example, on these measures here, is going back to this categorization on here, is that I could very easily just go into the drop down here and just go select just the absolute measures if I wanted to, and it's as simple as just filtering things. So
one of the probably maybe one of the smaller things that first impressed me was the it hadn't occurred to me that the order in which you select on the slicer is the order in which it appears on the hierarchy of the matrix. That was very cool. It's a shame there's no way of indicating which one people have clicked on first, as in on the slicer itself somehow. I know if you can see it in the visual, it would be cool if there was that functionality as well. But that's really nice, as you say, to let people. I mean, this is what I've loved about field parameters, is that just the complete flexibility it gives you is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I remember a couple of years ago, I'd created a report for someone at work, and they wanted to have changeable dimensions. This was
Mhm.
back before and to get it done was such a slog. It was so much work of extra tables and I achieved. I was so happy. And about 2 months later, field parameters came out. I was furious.
Well, I know. I found the same thing. I was building something with a fancy data model and fancy this, and it was like, field parameters.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's made my life easy now.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, I mean, interesting what Andrea is saying about the conditional formatting side of things. One of the things though is that what I've found with the conditional formatting of things is where it's great if your dimension is on the x-axis. If your dimension is in the legend, you got all levels of pain because there is no conditional formatting in the legend, and it drives me nuts. Because we do have it with our clients that we have to conditionally format the legend colors. And so what happens is that if you go into a particular visual, you have to make sure that you've got every single particular value that may exist in that dimension, code that up in the colors that you're needing for that, and then you can then go and bring in your correct data. So it obviously must cache it somewhere. And then you can actually, when you get that new entry, it knows what color needs to be actually used. And so when you have to do that across multiple dimensions on a particular visual, it can be very painful to actually do that.
I bet. Andreas also made another point, by the way. He said the sort order. So what I described as the cool sort order is also a disadvantage when you have to change the sort order. Like if you're just clicking through, you can accidentally change it. Is there a way around that? Like a trick to stop that from happening?
I need to. It's annoying me because I did see something not long ago.
Okay.
Where I found I found a YouTube video, and in the middle of the video they mentioned a little trick around it, and I was like, oh rats, I should have noted that down. Yeah. So there was a way around it, and I just can't remember as to how to actually get it to actually do that. I think it had something to do with the fact of where you could, if you took the field parameter off of the field well and then put it back in again, then it seemed to sort its life out.
That's interesting.
There was one other thing that they also showed, which I'll try and track it. I'll try and track it down if I can, and I'll let you know. But yeah, I definitely have seen a trick that somebody has found a way around it.
And this is also you mentioned yourself when you first started that this is still preview feature as well, of course. So there might be things that might with the preview features, there are things that sometimes you're not sure of features or bugs. Like if it's intentional that it's done that way. But it's been out for a while now, so I would suspect everything that is there is the way it's going to be when it gets generally released.
Yeah. I mean, it is quite. I am actually quite surprised that because I mean, what they came out, I think it was July last year, June, July, something like that. So it's been in preview for over a year. So, well, I mean, you never know. I mean, like ShapeMap. I mean, ShapeMap's been in preview ever since it came out. So for 5 years, 6 years, whatever it is. So yeah, I'm not sure if there is on that side, but yeah, I'll try and find out about the sort order side of things.
Okay, thank you. And someone also asked, by the way, if they were if the file could be made available. This PBX out here.
Yeah, I'll send it on to you, Ben,
Fantastic.
And then we can do whatever.
I'll find a way to distribute it somehow, yeah. But yes, basically, if you attend the meeting, maybe I can put that in the meetup or something. But I'll make sure it gets distributed to the people who have taken part today or signed up.
No worries at all. Yeah,
very nice.
It does make it a lot easier when you've got a PBX that you can play around with.
Well, actually, what I might do, I think someone else mentioned as well, I might play back the session. Once I've loaded it on YouTube, I'll play back the session and actually click through with you. Like actually with the PBX, I think that's probably a nice way of actually going through it. Yeah. But there's
not a problem.
Sorry, man. There's a lot to consider here, and really for me, Field parameters are one of the things that I've looked at, and I've used them, and I've enjoyed them, but I haven't gone that deep into them. So to see this is really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of the features, a lot of functions that I hadn't considered, to be honest. So should be good fun, and it's huge. It's such a big thing.
Oh, it is, and I'm always sort of. It's one of those things that I'm always sort of. I'll see something or I'll see something else that somebody's sort of trying to do something, and I think, oh, I want to go try it. How can I get around that? How can I try and do that? Or even at work, like I've been trying to get, trying to find a solution around getting around bookmarks and thinking, actual fact, how can I use field parameters to get around those bookmarks side of things, and thinking I found a way of doing it. And so it's it's always that fun part of how can you use it.
When it comes to report design, how do you feel about, because technically, I mean, what the temptation would be to create a report with only one page, and then everyone could just basically change all the dimensions and change all the measures on that. How would you do you try to balance that out somehow, that you restrict what can be done, or because there's something to say to be moving between pages for context and understand where, like, the journey through your data as well, and
that's the whole thing, and I think this is where this was born out of this whole setup was born purely out of as I said, a data auditing tool that we wanted to create in Power BI. And we originally had that tool in Excel. Now, obviously, Excel can only hold 1 million rows of data. But when you're trying to push a situation where you're trying to push 15, 20 million rows of data into a report, then this was the obvious thing. And so from that perspective, is that because it was purely being used as a auditing tool for people to say, is your data correct? And so I've seen Power BI being used in organizations as an auditing tool to sort of check their data side of things and check for errors in their data. And so there, you're not actually telling a story, really. It's more, this is the functionality that I'm actually wanting to use. How quickly and easily can I get that information? Whereas if I'm going down the other route of where I'm actually creating a sort of a report that's a story or doing something, then I'll be very careful about which field parameters I'll use, where I'll actually use those on the reports. And very much there, it's very, very rare. Well, I've never actually built a proper story report with this sort of complexity to it. I'll only ever have a situation where I'll very likely and very seldom would I even have the ability to switch out measures. It might only be to switch out a couple of the legends.
Okay.
Because this is what we're trying to actually tell them. And then we'll do that separately on another page. And on another page, there'll be a different way of looking at that data. So you may have a page that's looking at, your purchases. And so you'll have dimensions just for your purchases, but you may have a separate page that's a story about something else. And so I think it's one of the things that you just got to be careful and not think, oh, this makes my life easy. I can just do one page. There we go. Off you go, guys.
Okay. And I completely, and it's one of those things that the functionality is there and you have to learn how to use it correctly and not go overboard with it and stuff. But here's a good question. I was going to try and bring it on the screen like I do in a live stream. The field parameter selection can take up a fair amount of space. Have you played with bookmarks and a button to hide the field parameter slicer? Is that good, bad, annoying? To basically use a bookmark to hide those things?
I haven't done it with bookmarks, but you can just use the slicer in the actual field pane. So it's just another column. So it's just another column. So for example, this one here. For example, on here is that if I wanted to, is that I could actually just drag on the row into there, and I can use it there as a slicer.
Yeah, fair point. So actually using a filter pane rather than the slicer,
yeah. So I can do that. You obviously, you can. I've done that with using the filter pane instead of actually producing a slicer side of things, which is why I very, very rarely, if I use a field parameters, it'll normally only be a sort of slicer up at the top of the page.
Yeah.
I'll never ever waste my space on the left hand side for slices. I'll
Nice.
either use that or I use the field pane for it.
And it's funny, I love Alan's reaction because he's exactly the same. I also, for some reason, I never considered you could just put it in the filter pane. I'll be honest, I only recently started using the filter pane because I've never been a huge fan of it. But also the combination could work as well. You put like the two key ones on a slicer perhaps, and the rest go in the filter pane for like the secondary ones or something. But that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, the only downside with the filter pane is obviously in terms of creating your hierarchy. In the things. So, for example, on the measures side of things, where I've got a hierarchy involved here, is that I haven't found a way of doing that in the field pane side of things. And I also quite like it in a slicer here because it's a bit easier for somebody to actually see what's going on, particularly if it's using measures, whereas the other things, legends and x-axis, put in the filter pane. And that's where, if you do push those over in the filter pane, that's where you use a title that's dynamic. And so people can actually see what they're actually doing, because I've had it so often where people will select something in the filter pane, close it up, and they'll go, oh, I can't remember what I'm actually looking at.
Yeah, totally.
So,
I get that. I mean, Alan has followed up the question, how do users like using the filter pane? I suppose mildly getting off topic, but close enough. I can speak from my personal thing about the filter pane is that I think it's good for report design, but I think it's quite often it's too much for users, because I think a lot of the stuff with Power BI is this expectation of knowledge, which sometimes just isn't there and doesn't need to be there. And I always think it's not always. I sometimes think it's a step too far with the filter pane. This is just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're doing. I've had very good success with the filter pane with end users. And the reason for that is that part of the reason for it is that whenever I've published my reports is that I've always changed the background of the filter pane. So it's not white. It'll sort of match up with whatever format your theme is using. I've always set it up that if you apply something in the filter pane, it'll change color. The background will change color, so it doesn't stay the blue or the black or whatever.
That's nice.
So if you've selected something, it'll always change color. And also, too, is one of the key things that I found with the filter pane is not having too many things. Because the other thing as well that also people forget about is one of the key things that I find frustrating is that if you don't hide all the sort of the particular fields you've used on the visual itself, you potentially will then end up with a filter pane that as long as your arm side of things. If you hide all of that stuff and you just use the filter pane, what I've had very good success with is having a couple of, say for example, 4 key slices on your page. So the 4 slices that you think are the most important slices that the 80-20 rule, 80% of your people are going to need those 4 slices, and then put your other sort of edge case slices in the filter pane. And I've found that I've left the filter pane open when I've published the report, so people know that it's actually there and there's an alternative option to them. Is what I've found is where you close it up and you publish the report, so it'll by default you can go in and open it, but then people don't even know it's there. Whereas if you leave it open when you publish it, people actually can see it straight away. It's in front of them there, and so it's very easy to use.
That's true. Another thing with the filter pane is that as you're developing reports, quite often you'll put measures in, put dimensions in, take it back out again. But in the filter pane, it won't automatically remove those. You have to go back through and manually remove the things that you're actually not using anymore. So the filter pane can, as well as what you said, is hiding the not relevant values through that function, to actually get rid of the things that just shouldn't be there at all. So I think it's something that I slowly started to learn, because when I started to say, okay, I'm going to use this, because it does there are some good things about it for sure that I'd never considered. Just to kind of start paying more attention to it before you publish a report. And one of the things that you said also about changing the background color, that when something is actually selected, that's a huge benefit over a slicer, because with slicers currently you actually can't do that with a slicer, but with the filter pane you can, which is a very nice thing to have.
Exactly, and I really wish that would be you could do that with slices, would help a hell of a lot with things. But the other thing as well that I've also discovered with field parameters and talking about, hiding fields and things like that is that what I've ended up finding is, so for example, in this top visual here, is that if you go and hide ones here, is that what I've ended up finding that I've had to do is that when you first start out, is that you'll only have, for example, you'll only end up with, you might only end up with one particular field in here. So the one that you selected when you were building your report. And so what ends up happening then, and so you hide that one thinking, oh, that's hidden. But as soon as you start interacting with all the other ones will start appearing in the actual field pane. And so what I always do is that I cycle through every single one. Once I've built the report, I'll cycle through each of the field parameters, make sure that they're hidden or locked down in the actual visuals here. And then you can cycle through them and they won't actually show up.
That's a good tip. That's a good one.
Yeah,
I like it.
And so that's one thing to be sort of watch out for.
Yeah, nice one. Thank you. To see if there's any more questions. I think maybe Andreas is still writing something right now, but I think other than that, the chat is clear for questions. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else has, and I'll see what. Oh, we've got a couple of people writing right now. I'm on the edge of my seat. Anthony, there you go. So. Yeah, also great, Anthony. Thank you very much. And I'll let Andrea finish.
Yeah, that's
and
fine.
then we'll take it from there. But no, it's been a great session. I really appreciate it. And so I can say, if you hide active filters in the filter pane, you would not see them in the filter tooltip on visual level, right?
I think they do get hidden. But then do you want, one of the things though is that you can either just lock them down and leave them unhidden, depending on what you're wanting to do. I think one of the things that I found, which has been a major issue for me as a person publishing reports, is that if I haven't locked down or hidden the fields being used on the visual, somebody will come back and go, oh, my visual's not working. It's not showing me the right information. And then you think, why is it not going? So you go around the houses doing everything else, and then you suddenly realize, oh, they've gone and actually selected something in the filter pane and go and change the filter on there or something like that. And it can get hell of a frustrating as a person trying to actually resolve an issue, because they don't generally tell you that they've actually used the filter pane to do something. And also, too, there might be situations where you're purposely wanting to filter a visual on X, Y, and Z, but you don't want people to go and change those filters.
Yeah. So, yeah, sure, that makes sense.
Cool. Yeah.
Alrighty, I think
it really depends.
I think we've been through a lot, and there's been some great questions. The presentation was fantastic, and yeah, I think we're pretty much through. I'll stop recording in a second. I'll wait for any last questions. I wouldn't want to cut anyone off and be rude that way, But no, very nice stuff, and I shall try my best to incorporate some of these nice tips into my future reports and what have you.